I decided to take a solo trip into the forests of Norway, mixing hiking with camping. The view was amazing, with tall trees everywhere, thick green moss on the ground, and cold air that felt fresher than anything I'd ever breathed. The plan was simple: hike into the woods, set up camp, and spend a few nights alone, away from everything. The first day went smoothly. I walked along a well-marked trail for hours, then turned onto a quieter path that didn't seem to be used much. The deeper I went, the more cut off from the world it felt. By late afternoon, I found a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees and set up my tent. As the sun started going down, a thick fog rolled in, making everything quiet and strange. It felt a little unsettling, but I told myself it was just part of camping in the forest. That night, I lay in my tent, listening to the forest sounds. First, it was relaxing. The wind blowing through the trees, the sound of branches snapping, probably just animals moving around. But then I heard something else. A sharp snap, much closer this time. I told myself it was just more wildlife, maybe a deer. Still, something felt off. Whatever it was, it sounded heavier than a small animal. I pushed the thought aside and tried to sleep. The next morning, I packed up and kept hiking, going deeper into the forest. The fog still clung to the trees, making them seem closer, like they were pressing in. The trail I followed was faint and hard to see, but I kept pushing forward, wanting to stay on track. As the day went on, everything started looking the same, and for the first time, I felt a bit nervous. I had a map and a compass, but something didn't feel right. I couldn't put my finger on it. By mid-afternoon, I was tired and decided to set up camp again. The spot was a lot like the first one, a small clearing surrounded by trees. As I was unpacking, I noticed something strange. A small pile of rocks stacked neatly near the edge of the clearing. It didn't seem natural. I hadn't seen it when I walked in. Maybe it was just a marker left by another hiker, I thought. Still, it felt odd that it was here, far off the main trail. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The wind was louder, and the forest, which had seemed so alive the day before, now felt dead. Sometime in the early morning, I woke up to a faint crunching sound outside my tent. The air was so still I could hear my own breathing. The crunching was clear. Footsteps, slow, steady steps, not rushed, just careful. I froze, listening, trying to figure out how far away they were. They sounded close, way too close. I stayed still, barely breathing, trying to listen for any other sounds. But just as quickly as they had started, the steps stopped. I lay there, wide awake, for the rest of the night. When the sun finally came up, I crawled out of my tent. Nothing looked out of place. No tracks, no signs of anyone or anything. But when I looked back at the pile of rocks, my stomach dropped. Some of the rocks had been knocked over like someone had kicked them during the night. I didn't waste time. I packed up and started heading back the way I came. As I walked, though, the trail didn't look right. It felt different, like I was walking in the wrong direction, but I knew I was following the same path. I kept going, trying to stay calm, but after a few hours, I had to admit, I was lost. The fog had thickened, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Daylight was fading fast, and my nerves were wearing thin. I kept moving, trying to keep my mind clear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, really wrong. Then, through the fog, I saw it. Another pile of rocks, stacked just like the one from the night before, right in the middle of the path. My heart raced. This wasn't an accident. Someone or something was out here. I wasn't alone. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, heavy steps, coming from behind me. I turned quickly, scanning the fog, but I couldn't see anything. The footsteps kept coming, closer and closer. My hands were shaking as I started to walk faster, almost jogging, but no matter how fast I moved, the steps stayed with me, always just behind. I stopped, heart pounding, and stood perfectly still. The footsteps stopped too. I turned around again. Nothing but trees and fog. My head was spinning. Then, through the thick mist, I noticed something moving in the distance. A shadow, tall, still, but watching. I couldn't make out its face, but I knew it was watching me. I slowly backed away, barely able to breathe. The footsteps didn't come this time. Instead, the shadow seemed to melt into the fog. I ran. I don't know how long I kept running, but I didn't stop until my legs gave out. When I finally collapsed, I looked around and realized I was back at the first clearing where I had set up camp. I was back where I started, but the rocks were gone. I don't know how long I sat there, but when I finally stood up, I knew I couldn't stay. The forest had no plan of letting me go. The trail wasn't a way out anymore. It was a circle, leading me back again and again. And somewhere out there, I knew that Shadow was waiting, just out of sight, listening for my footsteps. I've worked as a park ranger for years now, and while the job can be tough, it's usually pretty simple. But a few months ago, I was sent on a search that still keeps me up at night. A hiker had gone missing, a young guy who went off the trail in a far part of the forest. Normally, when people get lost, we find them pretty fast. This time, though, something felt off from the very beginning. I hiked out with two other rangers, deep into the forest where the ground was rocky, the trees were thick, and the brush was high. It was far from any marked trail, the kind of place most people wouldn't wander into unless they had a reason. The first strange thing we noticed was how quiet everything was. No wind, no birds, not even the usual sounds of small animals moving around. Just dead quiet. It didn't feel right. We set up camp by a small stream that evening, planning to keep looking in the morning. After we ate, I took a short walk along the stream, trying to clear my mind. That's when I saw something strange. Big branches broken in odd ways. They weren't just snapped, they were twisted and shoved into the ground. I've seen animals break through branches, but this was different. It was too precise, like it had been done on purpose. The next day, we kept moving deeper into the woods. Hours went by, and there was no sign of the missing hiker. I started to feel uneasy. Just when I thought we might be getting closer, I saw something on the ground. A boot, half buried in the mud. It was old, like it had been there for weeks, not days. The weird thing was, it didn't look like it had been worn down by rain or weather. It looked almost fresh, like it had just been placed there. We still hadn't found the man, and something wasn't right. The deeper we went, the stranger the forest became. The trees looked warped, growing at odd angles, and I started to feel like we were walking in circles, even though the map and compass said we were on track. The other rangers didn't say anything, but I could tell they were feeling it too. By the time evening came, we found a small clearing where the grass was flat, like something or someone had been lying there recently. In the middle of it was a torn-up backpack, stuff spilled everywhere. Candy wrappers, a flashlight, and a map. Still no sign of the hiker. I crouched down to look through the stuff while the others set up camp. I noticed something strange right away. The map had an X drawn on it, about a mile away from where we were, but there were no trails or landmarks there. I had a bad feeling, but I couldn't ignore it. We decided to head to that spot first thing in the morning. The next day, we pushed on toward the X. The woods grew even thicker, and the silence got worse. No sounds at all, just us moving through the trees. Felt like the whole forest was pressing down on us. When we finally reached the spot marked on the map, there was nothing there, just more trees. The whole place felt wrong, like we shouldn't be there. We circled around, trying to figure out what the map meant. That's when we saw it. Hidden between the trees, barely noticeable, was an old cabin. I wasn't expecting to find any buildings out here. There shouldn't have been anything like that for miles. It was run down, almost falling apart. The door was barely hanging on, and the roof had caved in, but it was still standing enough to show someone had lived there once. We walked up slowly. The inside smelled damp, like mold and rot. The floor was covered with broken furniture, and the walls were stained dark from years of neglect. But in the corner, something caught my eye. A pile of old clothes, boots, and backpacks all mixed together. I immediately recognized one of the backpacks. It was the same one we had found in the clearing the day before. My heart started racing. The missing hiker wasn't the first one to disappear out here. This place had taken people before, and I had no doubt it would do it again. I felt sick. We were too close to becoming part of that pile. Without saying a word to each other, we packed up fast and left, walking as quickly as we could without running. The woods felt alive, like they were watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. By the time we got back to our camp, the sun was setting and long shadows stretched between the trees. I didn't feel safe until we were well away from that place. We never found the hiker, and I never went back to that part of the forest. The higher-ups wrote the case off, saying he must have gotten lost and died out there. But I know better. That forest isn't just dangerous. It's like something's hiding in it, something that takes people when they're not careful. I haven't told anyone this, but sometimes I wonder if the forest lets people go on purpose, just to lure more in. And when it gets the next one, it's like it never even happened. Some places you just shouldn't go. And that part of the woods, I don't think it's done taking people yet. I agreed to go camping and hiking with my neighbor and boss, Todd, over the weekend. I didn't really want to go, but he kept pushing, saying it would be good for us to hang out outside of work. I didn't know Todd that well, but I thought it might be nice to get out of the city for a bit. We left early in the morning and headed to a forest Todd knew about. He had been there a few times before, but it was new to me. The deeper we drove into the woods, the more cut off from everything it felt. About an hour into our hike, my phone lost signal. There was nothing around but trees as far as the eye could see. First, the hike was nice. The air felt fresh, and the trail was easy to follow. But as we moved further from the main path, something started to feel strange. Todd seemed to know where he was going, though. He led us deeper into the forest, far away from any sign of people. We finally stopped and set up camp in a small clearing. There were tall, thick trees all around us, and it was quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no animals, just the occasional sound of leaves moving in the wind. As the sun began to set, the loneliness of the place started to get to me. It was just me and Todd, miles away from anyone. I tried to push away the weird feeling I had, focusing on setting up my tent and starting a fire. Todd didn't seem to be in a rush. He just sat there, staring into the woods like he was lost in thought. He had been quiet since we got to the clearing, and it was starting to make me uneasy. He seemed distracted, almost like he wasn't really there. The first night went by without anything happening, but the next day things started to get weird. Todd suggested we go off the trail to explore a part of the forest he'd been to before. I wasn't so sure about leaving the path, but I followed him anyway. After a few hours, I realized I didn't know where we were. The trees all looked the same, and it was hard to remember which way we came from. I started to get nervous. Every turn we made seemed to lead us deeper into the woods. I told Todd we should head back, but he just kept going, saying we weren't lost. His calm attitude didn't make me feel better. It made me feel worse. Something about his confidence felt wrong, like he knew something I didn't. By the time the sun was starting to set again, we hadn't seen any signs of the trail or anyone else. The feeling in my gut told me something was off, and I was starting to wish I had never come. When we finally stopped to set up camp again, I didn't feel any better. The air was colder, and the trees seemed to press in around us. Couldn't relax. Every little sound in the woods made me jump. Todd, though, acted like nothing was wrong. He was almost too calm, like he knew we were safe, even though I had no idea where we were. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were outside my tent, slow and steady, walking around the camp. My heart started pounding in my chest. I stayed still, barely breathing, listening as the footsteps circled us. They didn't sound like an animal, they were too heavy. They sounded like a person. I didn't move. I didn't want whoever or whatever was out there to know I was awake. The footsteps stopped right next to my tent, and I could feel someone standing there, just outside the thin fabric. I held my breath, waiting for them to leave, but they didn't move. They just stood there listening. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Finally, the footsteps started again, slowly walking away from the camp and disappearing into the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too scared to even look outside. The next morning, Todd acted like nothing had happened. He packed up his gear and started heading back to the trail without saying a word. I didn't bring up the footsteps. I didn't want to sound crazy. But Todd's behavior was different. He seemed colder, distant, like something had changed in him. The hike back felt longer than before. Every rustle in the trees made me jump, and my nerves were shot. As we finally got back to the parking lot, I felt a huge sense of relief. I couldn't wait to get out of there and away from Todd. Something about the whole trip felt wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he had brought me out here for a reason. When we got to the cars, Todd gave me a strange smile and said he hoped we could do this again sometime. I forced a nod, but deep down, I knew I would never go camping with him again. That night, when I got home, I started unpacking my bag. As I pulled out my clothes, something fell out and hit the floor. It was my wallet. I stood there, staring at it, my heart racing. I had left my wallet in the car before we started the hike. I knew for a fact I hadn't taken it with me into the forest. So how did it end up in my backpack? I never spoke to Todd again after that. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear those slow, heavy footsteps outside my window. I was hiking with my grandfather in the mountains like we did every year since I was a kid. This year, we decided to camp out for a night halfway along the trail. We found a small open spot just off the path, set up the tent, and started a fire before the sun went down behind the mountains. The hike had been peaceful, but the air felt strange that evening. The forest around us seemed quieter than normal. My grandfather didn't seem bothered. He had been doing this for a long time, so I didn't say anything. As the night went on, the fire died down and we got into the tent. I lay there, staring up at the roof of the tent, listening to the sounds outside. Usually, the forest would be noisy at night. Crickets, wind, maybe an owl far off. But that night, there was nothing. Just silence. Hours went by and I couldn't sleep. My grandfather's deep breathing told me he was fast asleep, but I felt uneasy. The air outside the tent was too quiet, way too quiet. That's when I heard it, the soft sound of something moving outside, just beyond the trees. It wasn't a branch snapping or leaves moving, but a slow, steady crunch. Footsteps. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but the steps didn't sound right. They were slow, like someone walking carefully. The steps would stop, then start again, moving in a circle around our campsite. I held my breath, trying to listen as closely as I could. Whoever or whatever it was right outside, moving slowly around us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wanted to wake my grandfather, but I couldn't move. I kept telling myself it was just a hiker who got lost, but the way the footsteps moved, it didn't feel right. The steps got closer to the tent. They stopped right behind my head, and I could hear slow, heavy breathing, like someone was standing right there, looking down at us. My heart was racing, but I didn't move, couldn't. After what felt like forever, the breathing stopped, and the footsteps started again, moving away from the tent and back into the trees. I lay there with my eyes wide open, not sleeping for the rest of the night. When the sun finally rose and the light came through the trees, I slowly got up and stepped outside. There were no footprints, no sign anyone had been there. My grandfather stretched, packed up the gear, and acted like it was just another day. But something didn't feel right. We quickly left the campsite and walked back down the trail without saying much. Every few minutes, I found myself looking over my shoulder, thinking I might see someone standing at the edge of the trees. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that I was just imagining things. As we reached the end of the trail, something caught my eye. Carved into the bark of a tree right next to the path was a small mark. It was fresh, something I hadn't seen when we passed this spot yesterday. A single X. My grandfather didn't notice it, but I couldn't stop looking at it. To him, it probably didn't mean anything, but to me, it was a warning. A sign that someone had been out there with us that night, watching us walking around our tent while we slept. As we made our way to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had left that mark wasn't done. Maybe it was just a strange hiker, maybe not, but I couldn't forget how close those footsteps had been or how long that breathing had hung over me. The X might have just been the beginning, and I knew, deep down, that I'd see it again, somewhere else someday soon. Only next time I might not be as lucky. I had been planning this camping trip for a while, hoping to mix it with a hike in the national park. I didn't want to go too far into the woods, just far enough to be alone for a couple of days. I found a good spot by a stream, set up my tent, and figured I'd explore the area before it got dark. The trail went through thick trees, and the branches blocked most of the sky. It was quiet, except for birds and the occasional rustling in the bushes. The further I went, the more alone I felt, but I liked it. It was peaceful, a break from everything: work, noise, people. I didn't see anyone else all day. By the time I got back to my camp, it was getting dark. I made a small fire and sat down to eat, enjoying how quiet it was. I could hear the stream in the distance and the occasional snap of a branch in the woods. The night got colder, and once the fire was almost out, I crawled into my tent. I lay there, listening to the sounds of the forest, feeling safe in my little camp. But after a few hours, I woke up to a noise. At first, it was faint, but it sounded like footsteps. They were slow, circling my camp. My heart started to pound. I sat up, trying to hear better. The sound didn't stop. It was soft but clear, crunching through the leaves. I stayed still, hoping it was just a deer or some animal passing by. But the steps felt too slow and careful. They weren't random, and they weren't going away. I unzipped the tent just a little to peek out. The fire had died completely, and everything was pitch black. I couldn't see anything but the dark shapes of the trees. I listened again, but now the footsteps had stopped. It was silent for a while. I tried to lie back down, telling myself I was imagining it. Maybe I was just spooked from being alone out here. Then there was another sound. This time, it was the heavy crunch of something stepping on twigs, right by my tent. I sat up fast, my heart racing in my chest. The sound was much closer now, moving slowly, like whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be noticed. I reached for the knife I had in my bag. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to go outside, but I couldn't just sit there, waiting. The steps circled my tent again, faster this time. Then they stopped right behind me on the other side of the thin tent fabric. I held my breath, gripping the knife so tight my hand hurt. I listened, waiting for any movement, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, I heard the footsteps again, but this time they were moving away, slowly fading back into the trees until everything went quiet. I didn't sleep at all after that. Every small noise made me jump, thinking the footsteps would come back. As soon as the first light of morning crept through the trees, I packed my gear as fast as I could. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I just wanted to leave. On the hike back to my car, I kept looking over my shoulder. There was no one behind me, no sound, no sign of anyone being around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. When I finally got to the parking lot, I felt a little relief, but that's when I saw it. A footprint in the dirt, right next to my car door. It was large, much bigger than mine, and pressed deep into the ground. I stared at it for a while, frozen. The shape of it looked almost human, but not quite right. I threw my stuff into the car and got out of there as fast as I could. It wasn't until I was halfway home that I realized something chilling. Those footsteps last night had stopped behind my tent, right before moving away. And if that footprint was by my car, how long had they been watching me before I even noticed? I haven't been back to the woods since. I'm not sure I ever will. I packed my stuff for the weekend, ready to escape the noise of the city and head into the woods. It was 1968, a time when everything felt like it was changing, but out here things were simple. I wanted peace, but what I found was something far worse. I set up camp by a small lake, surrounded by tall pine trees. As night fell, I lit a fire, its flames casting shadows against the trunks. I settled in, enjoying the warmth and the comfort of being alone. But soon, a strange silence took over the night. The chirping crickets stopped, and an eerie quiet wrapped around the area. I tried to ignore it. I pulled out my radio for some music, but all I got was static. That's when I heard it, a low, distant howl drifting through the trees. I froze. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Felt wrong, like a warning. Curiosity nagged at me. I grabbed my flashlight and decided to check it out. I walked deeper into the woods, the light cutting through the darkness. The trees loomed above me, their branches stretching out like long fingers. Every crack of a twig made my heart race. I had no clue what I was looking for, but the howl had stirred something deep inside me. After a while, I stumbled upon a clearing. In the center was an old ranger's cabin. It looked abandoned, but the door was slightly open. Hesitant, I moved closer. The air felt thick, heavy with unease. As I stepped inside, the floor creaked beneath my weight. The cabin was empty except for dust and old furniture. A rusty lantern hung from the ceiling, and a map of the area lay open on the table. Something caught my eye. The map had several spots marked in red search areas. My heart raced. Had there been a search for someone? Suddenly, I heard footsteps outside. They were heavy and slow. Panic surged through me. I ducked behind the table, the old wood splintering beneath me. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped. I waited in silence, my heart pounding in my ears. Then I heard voices, faint but urgent. They were close. I slowly peeked around the corner of the table. I saw flashlights moving outside, their beams cutting through the dark like hands searching for something. They were looking for something or someone. I knew I had to get out. I slipped out the back of the cabin, careful to stay low. The night was dark and heavy, and I moved quickly through the trees, my heart racing. The voices grew louder, filled with urgency. I glanced back, but no one was in sight. I reached my campsite, packed my gear in a hurry, and glanced around, feeling exposed. The howling returned, closer this time, echoing through the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. With my pack slung over my shoulder, I began to hike down the trail as fast as I could. My instincts screamed that I needed to get to safety. As I neared the edge of the woods, I spotted a group of officers entering the clearing, their flashlights cutting through the brush. I ducked behind a tree, watching as they scanned the area. Their faces were tense, eyes darting with purpose. They were looking for something or someone, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what. Finally, I made it to my car and breathed a sigh of relief. I got in and drove away, leaving the creepy woods behind. But as I pulled onto the main road, the howling echoed in my mind, chilling me to the bone. The events of that night would haunt me. I had gone into the forest seeking solitude, but instead, I stumbled upon a dark secret hidden beneath the trees. As I glanced in my rearview mirror, I thought I saw a shadow flitting through the woods, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. I drove faster, but the feeling of being watched never left. I realized too late, not all who wander are lost, and not all who search ever come back. It had been a long time since I went camping with my ex-husband. We thought we'd give it another try, hoping some fresh air might help us reconnect. We found a quiet spot in the woods, far from the crowded campsites. The drive there was calm, but the silence felt heavy with tension. Setting up the tent felt familiar. I watched him hammer the stakes into the ground while the sun peeked through the trees. As night came, we built a small fire and sat close, its flickering light casting shadows on our faces. I tried to push away old memories, focusing on the crackling fire and the fresh scent of pine all around us. Later that night, after the stars lit up the sky, I heard a rustling sound. At first, it was just a whisper of leaves. I glanced at my ex-husband, but he didn't seem to notice. The noise got louder, like something was moving through the brush. A chill crept up my spine, but I tried to convince myself it was just a deer. I stood up to check, my heart pounding. The trees loomed over us, dark and tall, making it hard to see anything. I moved quietly, straining to hear. Suddenly, I saw something. A figure standing just beyond the fire's light. My heart dropped. It looked like a man, but his face was hidden in the shadows. Panic rushed through me. I stumbled back, trying to stay quiet, but I kicked a rock. The sound echoed in the stillness. The figure turned, and for a moment, I thought I saw its eyes shine in the firelight. I darted back to the tent, breathless and terrified. I shook my ex-husband awake, my voice barely a whisper. He woke up startled, looking confused. I told him I saw someone. He frowned and grabbed a flashlight. We stepped outside together, the beam cutting through the darkness, but the figure was gone. Only the wind whispered through the trees. We searched the area, but there was nothing. I felt silly for being scared. Maybe it was just my imagination. We returned to the tent, but sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound made me jump, and I felt like we were being watched. At dawn, we packed up quickly, the morning light showing the beauty of the woods, but unease hung in the air. As we drove home, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following us. The trees seemed to close in, shadows stretching unnaturally. That camping trip didn't just bring back memories of us. It reminded me of the hidden dangers that could be lurking in the woods. Even after we left, that sense of dread stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. The woods felt alive, as if they held secrets meant to stay hidden. As we drove further away, I recalled the figure in the darkness. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It felt real. I remembered the way the eyes seemed to glint, a reflection of something primal and wild. What if we weren't alone out there? What if that presence had followed us, lurking just out of sight? We may have been trying to reconnect, but the woods showed me something darker. Some things should remain buried, not just memories, but the very essence of fear that creeps in when you least expect it. I glanced back at the woods one last time, a chill running down my spine, knowing that some places are better left untouched, haunted by shadows that may never truly leave. I had been planning this trip for months, just me, alone, hiking and camping for the weekend in the deep woods of the Pacific Northwest. I needed a break from all the noise and stress back home, some time to just breathe, clear my head. It felt like the perfect way to get away from everything. I parked my car at a small parking area by the trail early in the morning. I threw my backpack on and started walking. It was quiet. All I could hear was my boots crunching on the dirt and the wind moving through the trees. The farther I went, the less I saw any sign of people. Hours passed, and eventually, I found a spot by a stream where I could set up camp. It was peaceful, just the sound of water moving over rocks and the occasional bird chirping in the distance. I hadn't felt this alone in a long time, and it felt good. As the day went on, the sun started going down, and the air got colder. I gathered some wood and lit a small fire. Sitting there by the flames, eating, I felt a bit proud of myself for coming out here alone, for handling the quiet. It was just after the sun had set that I first heard it. A distant sound, soft at first, like someone hitting something, deep in the woods. Thump, thump. It was slow, rhythmic. I looked around, confused. I knew for sure that there weren't any other campsites for miles, and there shouldn't be anyone else out here. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe it was just the wind or some animal moving around. But the sound didn't stop. In fact, it got louder, closer. My stomach started to tighten, and something in the back of my mind told me something wasn't right. I threw more wood on the fire, hoping the flames would make me feel safer, but the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. Then suddenly the noise stopped. Everything went completely quiet. No wind, no crackling fire, nothing. I just sat there, staring into the flames, listening hard, but there was nothing. The woods were dead silent. That night I barely slept. Every sound outside the tent had me wide awake. Every little creak from the trees or snap of a twig made my heart race. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was just letting my mind play tricks on me. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As soon as the first bit of sunlight broke through the trees, I packed up my stuff as fast as I could and started heading back. The air felt different now, heavier, like the woods weren't as welcoming as they were before. I tried to stay calm, but as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The weirdest part was that I started hearing footsteps behind me. Not all the time, but every now and then, it felt like someone was walking just a little too close behind me. I'd stop, turn around, look, but there was nothing, just thick trees and silence. I tell myself I was just being paranoid, that it was just in my head. But as soon as I started moving again, I'd hear it, the sound of something following. By late morning, I had to stop and rest. My legs were tired, and my nerves were shot. I found a small clearing, dropped my pack, and sat down. As I was catching my breath, I noticed something strange on the ground. Footprints, fresh ones, leading off the trail and into the deeper part of the woods. They weren't mine. They looked human, but the person wasn't wearing any shoes. My skin crawled when I realized what I was seeing. Someone else had been walking out here barefoot. I didn't know how I hadn't noticed them before. I knelt down and saw that the prints weren't coming from the direction I had come from. They were leading the same way I was going, like whoever made them had been ahead of me the whole time. But I hadn't seen a single person since I started this hike. That was enough for me. I picked up my stuff and started moving as fast as I could, not caring about the hike anymore. I just wanted to get back to my car and leave. The woods felt like they were closing in on me, and every step I took, it felt like the trees were watching, hiding something just out of sight. My heart was racing, and I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the time I finally made it back to the trailhead and saw my car, I felt a huge sense of relief. I tossed my pack into the back seat, slammed the door shut, and locked it right away. I sat there for a minute, breathing heavily, trying to calm myself down. But as I sat there, something caught my eye on the ground next to my car. Another set of footprints, barefoot, the same ones I had seen earlier. But these weren't just in the woods anymore. They led right up to the passenger side of my car, like someone had been standing there, waiting. My hands were shaking as I started the car, and just before I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Far off in the trees, I saw something move. I had a few days off and thought it would be a good idea to spend them hiking and camping in a forest not too far from home. I knew the area pretty well, having been there a few times before, so I didn't worry much about anything going wrong. Being a police officer, I'm used to handling stressful stuff all the time. A quiet break in the woods sounded like just the thing I needed. I parked my car at the starting point of the trail, grabbed my backpack, and headed down the path. The weather was perfect, sunlight shining through the trees, and the trail was empty. Felt like I had the whole place to myself. After walking for a few hours, I found a good spot to set up my camp next to a small stream. It was peaceful, with the sound of water running, and I got my tent up without any problems. That first night was quiet. I slept fine, waking up early to the sound of birds. I spent the next day wandering around, climbing up a hill that had a great view of the forest below. The view was amazing, and being alone gave me some time to clear my head. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was going down, and it was starting to get cooler. That second night, though, something felt off. At first, I couldn't figure out what it was, but the feeling just kept growing. I tried to tell myself it was because I was out here alone, and maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Even though I've been in some pretty tough spots at work, being out here by yourself in the middle of nowhere can mess with your head. As the night got darker, I noticed the forest was a lot quieter than the night before. The usual sound of insects buzzing was gone, and even the animals rustling in the bushes seemed to have disappeared. I tried to ignore it and focused on the fire, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then I heard something, a faint sound, like footsteps coming from deeper in the woods. It was soft, almost like someone trying to move without making noise, but the leaves on the ground gave them away. At first, I thought it might be another hiker, but who'd be walking around the woods at this time of night? I sat still and listened. The footsteps stopped, and everything went quiet again. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe just my imagination. But then later I heard it again. This time, the footsteps were closer, moving slowly around my camp, like someone was circling it. My heart started racing. Whoever it was didn't want to be seen, and that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I sat up in my sleeping bag, holding my breath, waiting to hear more. The footsteps stopped again, but I knew whoever was out there was still close. I felt like someone was watching me, and it was hard to stay calm. I reached for my belt, but my gun was outside the tent with my gear. I had two choices: stay in the tent and hope it was nothing, or go out there and see what it was. Normally, I'm the type to face things head on, but out here, without anyone to back me up, I wasn't so sure. I stayed still, hoping whoever it was would just leave. Then, I heard the sound again, this time right outside the tent. The footsteps stopped, and I could see a shadow standing just outside the thin fabric. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my chest. Whoever it was, they were too close. And then, just like that, they moved away. The footsteps grew fainter until everything went completely silent again. I didn't sleep at all after that. I sat up in my tent, listening to every little sound, waiting for them to come back. When the sun finally came up, I packed up as quickly as I could. I didn't even bother making breakfast. I wanted to get out of there. Something had been out there last night, and I wasn't about to stick around to see what it was or what it wanted. As I walked back toward my car, I kept looking over my shoulder, sure I was being followed. When I finally got back to my car, I tossed my stuff in the trunk and jumped inside, feeling a wave of relief as I started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing there in the trees, watching me. But there was no one. When I got home, the feeling still didn't go away. It stuck with me, like someone had been watching me the whole time I was out there. Whoever or whatever it was, they knew how to stay hidden. They didn't want me to see them, but they wanted me to know they were there. That's what bothers me the most. Not knowing who it was or why they were out there, stalking me through the woods. I can still hear those slow, quiet footsteps circling my camp, and I don't think I'll ever forget them. It's not just the footsteps, though. I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there that night didn't follow me out of the woods. Sometimes, when I'm home alone at night, I swear I hear those same footsteps. Slow, quiet, circling, and when I check outside, there's no one there, just like in the woods. I'll never go back to that forest, but deep down I know it doesn't matter. We were sent on a normal search mission in the mountains. Our group had been told to check out an area that seemed suspicious. People were saying there might be illegal camps hidden deep in the forest, so it was our job to look into it. I had been on many hikes and training missions in rough places before, but this one felt different. The air was thick, and the sky was covered in clouds. Even the trees seemed closer together than usual, their shadows stretching out as we walked deeper into the woods. After hours of walking, we set up camp for the night. Our setup was simple, just some tents, sleeping bags, and a small area marked around us. I had to take the first watch. I sat with my rifle, eyes scanning the dark, which seemed to swallow everything past the little light from our campfire. The forest was strangely quiet. No usual sounds of animals, just the wind blowing through the trees and sometimes the crack of a branch breaking far away. As the hours went by, I started getting tired, but I made myself stay awake. That's when I noticed something weird. The trees, which had looked thick before, now seemed to form clear paths, like trails leading deeper into the forest. Trails that hadn't been there earlier, as if someone or something had made them. My curiosity got the best of me. I grabbed my gear and slowly walked down one of the paths. I didn't go too far, just enough to see where it went. But the further I went, the stranger things got. The trees weren't just forming paths. They looked disturbed, like something had recently moved through them, snapping branches and leaving deep footprints in the dirt. My heart started to beat faster, a bad feeling growing inside me. I turned back to camp, but as I retraced my steps, the path seemed to twist. Felt like the forest was messing with me. The shadows were thicker. The trees now felt like huge walls closing in. Every direction I looked, the way back seemed blocked by rows of trees that weren't there before. I wasn't lost, but something felt very wrong. I could feel it. Something was watching me. Then I saw it. Movement, fast and low, darting between the trees. My heart was racing, but I couldn't make out what it was. It didn't seem like a person, but it wasn't an animal either. I gripped my rifle tighter and sped up, trying to stay calm. I told myself it was all in my head, that I was just tired. But then I saw more. Shadows moving in and out of my sight, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I froze as I heard the rustling of leaves, now much closer. Whatever it was quick and silent. I felt like prey being hunted. I pushed through the trees and stumbled back into camp, breathing hard, soaked in sweat. The others were still asleep, totally unaware of what had just happened. I didn't say anything. What could I even say? I didn't know what I had just seen. The rest of the night dragged on, but I didn't sleep. I sat there, heart pounding, rifle in hand, waiting for the sun to rise. When dawn finally came, we packed up our gear and left, but the feeling didn't leave me. As we hiked back down the mountain, I glanced back at the forest one last time. There was no movement now, no strange shadows. But I knew whatever was out there was still there, hiding just behind the trees, watching. It wasn't going to leave. It wasn't finished. It had let us go this time, but it was just waiting for the next time we came too close. And I knew deep down that the next time, none of us would be making it out. It wasn't just watching us. It was planning. Whatever it was, it knew us now. It was only a matter of time. I decided to take my grandmother on a small camping trip near a hiking trail she used to love. She hadn't been out in the wild for years, and I thought it would be a nice way for her to relive some old memories. We found a quiet spot deep in the woods, away from other campers. The trail we planned to hike was one she always talked about, saying it had the best views. The first day went smoothly. We set up the tent, cooked some food, and she seemed happy. The woods were peaceful, just the sound of leaves rustling from the wind or a small animal passing by. As night fell, the forest got quieter, with only the sound of insects buzzing in the background. Felt calm. The next morning, we packed a small bag and started hiking. The trail was steeper than I remembered, and I had to help my grandmother a few times over rocks and uneven ground. Even though it was a bit tough, she was in good spirits, telling me stories about the times she had walked the same trail when she was younger. As we hiked further, the trees seemed to close in around us, blocking out more of the sunlight. It felt like we were walking into a different place, where the forest seemed more alive, more intense. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I pushed it aside, thinking it was just me being too paranoid. After about an hour, we reached a clearing. It wasn't the one I remembered from hiking this trail years ago, but my grandmother seemed sure it was the right spot. The trees opened up to show a small, rocky spot that overlooked the forest below. We took a break, sitting down to enjoy the view, but I couldn't relax. There was something strange in the air, like the whole forest had gone still. Then, I noticed something odd in the distance, down in the valley. It looked like a small building, almost hidden by the trees. I didn't remember seeing it before, and it didn't look like one of the cabins or ranger stations nearby. It was too far to see clearly, but something about it felt wrong. It was just a dark shape in the trees, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. My grandmother stood up and stared at the same spot. She was unusually quiet, like she was deep in thought. She didn't seem like herself. After a long moment, she motioned for us to head back. I didn't argue. That uneasy feeling I had been trying to push away was getting stronger. The hike back felt longer, and the forest seemed darker, even though the sun was still high. Every sound around us seemed louder. The crunch of leaves under our boots, the snap of a branch somewhere in the distance. I kept glancing behind us, feeling like we were being followed, but there was nothing. Just the trees and the shadows. When we got back to the campsite, something was wrong. Our tent was gone. Everything we had left behind was missing. There were no signs of anyone else around, no footprints, nothing. The fire pit we had used was cold, like it hadn't been touched in days. A sinking feeling hit me. My grandmother didn't say a word, just stared at the empty space where our tent had been. I tried to think of what to do. There was no way we had been gone long enough for someone to take everything without leaving a single trace. It didn't make sense. With no other choice, we decided to head back to the car, which was parked about a mile away. As we walked, the feeling of being watched never left. I couldn't shake the idea that something was following us, keeping just out of sight. I kept turning around, but there was nothing, just the empty trail behind us. When we finally reached the car, I felt a wave of relief. But that relief quickly disappeared when I saw the state of it. The windows were smashed, the tires slashed. It looked like someone, or something, had gone out of their way to make sure we couldn't leave. We were stuck. I checked my phone, hoping for some signal, but there was nothing. The nearest help was miles away, and with my grandmother's health, there was no way we could walk all the way there. As I stood there, trying to figure out what to do next, I felt it again, that cold, crawling feeling of being watched. I looked back at the trail, scanning the trees. For a second, I thought I saw movement, something shifting in the shadows. But it was gone before I could get a good look. I glanced at my grandmother. She was staring into the woods too, her face pale, her body stiff. She knew something I didn't, something about this place that she hadn't told me. We ended up spending the night in the car, too scared to sleep. Every noise outside felt like it was creeping closer, getting closer to us. But nothing ever happened. Just that constant feeling that something was out there, waiting. By morning, we had no choice but to start walking, hoping we'd find help somewhere. But deep down, I knew we weren't alone in those woods. Whatever had been watching us, whatever had been there the whole time, it wasn't going to let us leave easily. We made it out eventually, but I'll never forget how those woods felt. Like they were alive, like something was hiding just out of sight. Something that had been waiting for us. I still don't know what it was, but I haven't gone back since. And my grandmother never spoke about that trail again. I think she knew we weren't supposed to be there, and I think whatever was out there knew it too. I went camping and hiking with my boss last weekend. It wasn't really something I wanted to do, but he made it sound like I had no choice. I've never thought of him as someone who enjoys the outdoors, but he was really set on showing me his favorite spot deep in the woods. I figured it was a good way to stay on his good side, so I agreed. At first, everything seemed normal. We walked for hours along the trail, passing through thick trees and rocky hills. The further we went, the quieter it got. No sounds of birds or anything. And I realized after a while that we hadn't seen another person the entire time. It felt like we were the only two people out there, far from everything. Around noon, we stopped to rest near a small stream. That's when he started acting weird. My boss is usually calm and collected, but now he kept looking around, like he was waiting for something to happen. I brushed it off at first, thinking he was just tired. But as we kept going, his behavior got worse. He kept wandering off the trail, saying he knew a shortcut. But it was clear to me there was no shortcut, just more trees. The more I tried to stick to the main path, the more annoyed he seemed to get. The sun was starting to set, and we were still far from the campsite. I knew we should have turned back, but he insisted we keep going. I didn't want to push my luck by arguing, so I just followed him, even though I had a bad feeling. When it got dark, that's when things got really strange. He suddenly stopped in the middle of the trail and just stared ahead. He didn't move. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, frozen, looking at something in the distance that I couldn't see. The air felt heavy, and everything around us seemed off. I tried to snap him out of it, but he didn't react. His eyes were wide, and his breathing was quick and shallow. I looked around, trying to see what he was looking at, but there was nothing, just trees, shadows, and the dark sky above us. That's when it hit me we were completely alone. No cell service, no other hikers. It was just me and my boss, and he looked like he had lost his mind. I started to panic. I had no idea how to get us back, and he was no help at all. Without saying a word, he suddenly turned and started walking again, but he wasn't heading back to the campsite. He was walking deeper into the woods, away from the trail. I followed him for a little bit, hoping he had some plan I didn't know about, but it didn't take long for me to realize that he was just wandering. He didn't know where he was going. He was walking in a daze, like he wasn't really there. I knew I had to make a choice: follow him deeper into the forest or find my own way out. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave. I tried calling out to him one last time, but he didn't even look back. He just kept walking, slowly disappearing into the trees. I turned around and started running. I tried to remember the way we came, but everything looked the same in the dark. The trees felt like they were closing in on me, every direction twisting and turning, no path in sight. My heart was racing as I tripped over rocks and branches, barely able to see where I was going. After what felt like forever, I somehow found the trail again. I followed it as fast as I could, running until I reached the campsite. By the time I got there, it was pitch black. I collapsed by the fire pit, too tired and too scared to think. My boss never showed up. The next morning, I left. I didn't wait around. I just packed up my stuff and hiked out of there as fast as I could. When I got back to town, I reported him missing. They sent out search teams, but no one ever found him. It's like he vanished into thin air. I still think about that trip a lot. I can't shake the feeling that my boss knew something was out there, something that had been waiting for him. He wasn't just acting strange for no reason. He was scared, like he knew what was coming. Whatever it was, he walked right into it. He didn't even try to fight it. It's like he knew he wasn't coming back. I decided to go camping and hiking one weekend, wanting to escape the noise of everyday life. My neighbor had mentioned a trail not too far from town, one that wasn't busy, with some nice spots to set up camp for a night or two. It sounded perfect, so I packed my gear and left early. The trail started off easy. It was quiet, just the sounds of the wind through the trees, the crunch of leaves under my boots, and the occasional bird. As I walked deeper into the woods, the path became narrower, and the trees grew closer together. I began to feel isolated, but that's what I wanted: a bit of peace. After a few hours, I found a good spot to set up my tent. The clearing was small but hidden, with a view of distant mountains. I spent some time gathering sticks and building a small fire before the sun went down. As night fell, I started hearing noises from the woods. I told myself it was normal, just the forest, animals moving around, branches breaking. But the sounds felt different, more like footsteps. They stopped when I focused on them. I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and lay there, listening to the fire crackle. That's when I heard it, a rustling right outside the tent, like something was moving around. It wasn't far from where I had left my backpack. My heart raced, but I stayed still, hoping whatever it was would just go away. Minutes passed, and the sound faded. I tried to shake it off and sleep, but soon I heard something again. This time, it was a clear sound of something brushing against the side of the tent. Slowly, I reached for the flashlight beside me, turned it on, and unzipped the tent. I expected to see a raccoon or maybe even a deer, but the camp was empty. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, casting long shadows on the trees. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I sat by the fire for a while, letting the light and heat calm me down. The noises stopped, and I tried to convince myself it was just the woods playing tricks. Eventually, I crawled back into the tent and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I woke up early, ready to pack up and leave. But something felt wrong. My backpack had been moved, not far from where I left it, but enough to make me wonder if I had been careless. Then I noticed something else. The ground near the tent had fresh footprints. Not animal tracks, but human shoes. They were too big to be mine, and they circled my tent. A cold wave of fear washed over me. Someone had been here, watching me while I slept. I packed my things as fast as I could, constantly looking around, feeling the weight of eyes on me. I kept hearing sounds from the trees, but I didn't want to stay to find out who or what was out there. I hurried down the trail, every snap of a twig making me jump. When I finally reached my car, I felt a strange mix of relief and fear. Whoever had been watching me never showed themselves, but they were close, too close for comfort. I never went back to that trail. The thought of someone circling my tent, lurking in the shadows while I slept, haunted me. Now, whenever I hear my neighbor mention another camping spot, a chill runs down my spine, and I find an excuse not to go. The woods are beautiful, but they hide secrets, and some things should never be disturbed. You can be alone in the woods, but you're never truly alone. The sun had already set when I reached the campsite deep in the woods of Washington State. I had hiked for hours, excited to spend the night alone under the stars. The air was cool, and the smell of pine was all around me. I set up my tent and started a small fire, the crackling flames giving off a cozy warmth as darkness settled in. After a quick dinner, I leaned back on a log, looking up at the sky. The stars sparkled like diamonds, and I felt a sense of calm wash over me. But then I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. At first, I brushed it off, telling myself it was just a small animal. But as the rustling continued, my heart started to race. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the sound. The beam of light cut through the dark, but all I saw was the outline of trees moving in the wind. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, but that rustling kept nagging at me. Feeling restless, I decided to take a short walk, hoping it would help clear my mind. As I moved deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The shadows seemed to get darker, and the trees stood tall like silent guards. I turned back toward my campsite, but the path I thought I had taken felt strange and unfamiliar. My heart raced as I realized I might be lost. After several minutes of stumbling through the underbrush, I finally saw a flicker of light, my campfire. Relief washed over me as I hurried back, but when I arrived, my stomach dropped. The fire was out, and my things were scattered everywhere. It looked like someone had gone through my gear. Panic hit me hard. I grabbed my flashlight and looked around, the beam shaking in my hand. Just then, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, heavy steps crunching on twigs. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The woods felt alive, whispering secrets I couldn't understand. Heart racing, I crouched behind a big rock, trying to breathe quietly. I strained to listen, every nerve in my body on high alert. Then I saw movement in the shadows. Something was out there, just beyond the reach of my light. My mind raced with possibilities. A lost hiker? Someone who meant me harm? I had no way of knowing, but I knew I needed to get out of there fast. I quietly made my way back along the trail, sticking close to the trees to stay hidden. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I pushed myself to move faster, adrenaline pumping through my veins. The last thing I wanted was a confrontation. All I could think about was reaching my car at the trailhead, where I would finally feel safe. As I got closer to the end of the trail, I spotted my car in the distance, a familiar sight that filled me with hope. I glanced back, half expecting to see someone following me. But all I saw was darkness swallowing the forest behind me, nothing but trees and shadows. I jumped into the car, locked the doors, and turned the engine over. As I sped away from the campsite, I looked in the rearview mirror. The woods stood silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me from the shadows. Once I was back on the main road, my heart began to slow, but the fear lingered. I couldn't help but replay everything in my mind. Had I really been alone out there? The rustling, the footsteps, it all felt too real. As I drove home, I felt a chill creep up my spine. I couldn't shake the image of the shadow I saw flicker just out of sight. It was like the woods were hiding something, and I couldn't escape the feeling that whatever was out there was waiting for its next chance. Alone in the dark, I realized that nature has its secrets, and some of them are best left undiscovered. I had always dreamed of hiking through the Amazon rainforest, camping right in the middle of the wildest place in South America. The stories I heard about the Amazon grabbed my attention, the dangers, the size of the place, and the strange animals living there. It seemed like the jungle had a life of its own. When I finally got the chance to go, I didn't think twice. I packed light, just the things I needed for a few days, and got ready for some time alone, deep in the forest. The first few hours of hiking were just as exciting as I had hoped. Birds and insects made noise all around me. The trees stretched high, their branches thick with leaves, making a green ceiling above. Every once in a while, I saw animals moving between the trees, but they were too fast for me to get a good look. Being out there on my own made everything feel different, like I had stepped back in time, away from the rest of the world. By the middle of the day, I found a small open spot next to a stream and decided to set up my camp. I put up my tent and ate a quick meal, then walked around the area to take in the surroundings. The thick jungle made it hard to see far, but I figured as long as I stayed close to the stream, I wouldn't get lost. The daylight started fading quicker than I thought, and the jungle got dark, the air cooler. I gathered some dry sticks and made a small fire, watching the flames as the shadows around me grew longer. That's when I first noticed something was wrong. The usual jungle sounds, buzzing insects, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, stopped all at once. It was dead silent. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe it was just the shift from day to night. But the silence felt strange. My gut told me something was watching me. I looked around, trying to spot anything, but saw nothing. The firelight only reached so far, and past that, everything was pitch black. I tried to calm myself, but every little noise, a leaf falling, a branch cracking, made my heart race. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it into the jungle, but all I saw were thick plants and trees. Whatever was out there, it was staying hidden. The night dragged on and I barely slept. I kept hearing footsteps, breathing, branches snapping in the dark. But whenever I checked, nothing was there. I started doubting myself. Was my mind playing tricks on me? By morning, I was exhausted. I decided to pack up and leave early. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, like something was watching my every move from the trees. I needed to get out of there. I packed up quickly and started hiking back the way I came, staying alert the whole time. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. Every few minutes, I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see something move between the trees, but there was still nothing. By afternoon, I reached the point where the jungle began to thin out. I felt a bit more relaxed, but then I saw it, deep in the mud along the path, a footprint, and it wasn't mine. It wasn't from any animal either. It was big, barefoot, and fresh. Whoever or whatever had made it was nearby. I stopped cold, my eyes scanning the trees. I didn't hear or see anything, but I knew I wasn't alone. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a quick glimpse of movement. Something darted behind the trees, fast. Too fast for me to see clearly, but it was human-shaped. At least it looked human. I didn't stick around to find out more.
I started running.
The jungle felt like it was closing in on me as I ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back, but I could hear something following me, its footsteps fast and getting closer. It felt like the whole forest was alive, forcing me out. When I finally reached the edge of the jungle, I was drenched in sweat and out of breath. I stopped, turned around, and looked back at the trees. Nothing moved. The jungle was silent again, like whatever had been following me was gone. But I knew better. That feeling of being watched, it didn't leave. Even after I made it out of the Amazon and back to safety, the memory stayed with me. I kept thinking about that footprint in the mud. Whatever had made it had been close, so close, and I realized something terrifying. It had been watching me the whole time, following me, waiting for the right moment. It didn't attack, not because it couldn't, it just didn't want to, and that thought still keeps me up at night. We had been out in the woods for a few days, part of a training mission. The job was to find our way through thick forests and tough ground, camping wherever we could. It was me and 3 other guys, all of us soldiers, all used to roughing it outside. But something about this area felt strange from the start. The forest was way too quiet. No birds, no wind in the trees, just stillness. It made me uneasy, like the trees were watching us. But we kept going, following the map, trying to stay on track. When the sun started to go down, we decided to stop and set up camp near a small clearing. We got a fire going, ate some quick food, and then settled into our sleeping bags under the open sky. I had first watch. The hours dragged on and nothing happened. It was calm, but that weird feeling still lingered, like something wasn't right. I kept scanning the trees every few minutes, making sure nothing was moving out there. When my shift was over, I woke up the next guy and slipped into my sleeping bag, trying to shake off that unease. I eventually fell asleep, but it wasn't a deep sleep. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. It was pitch black, and I had no idea why I was awake, but my heart was pounding in my chest. I stayed still and listened. All I could hear was my own breathing. Then I smelled something. It was faint at first, but I knew it wasn't right. It smelled like metal, like blood. I sat up slowly, trying not to make any noise. The fire had burned down to just glowing coals, giving off a weak light. I looked around at the others. They were all still sleeping, but that smell was getting stronger. Then I heard something, a soft crunching sound, like someone walking carefully on dry leaves. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned my head toward the noise. In the dim light, I saw something move near the edge of the trees, just outside the camp. I couldn't tell what it was, but there was definitely something there, crouched low, staying in the shadows. My mind raced. It wasn't one of the guys. They were all right here, and it wasn't an animal. Animals don't move like that. I froze, hoping it hadn't seen me. The footsteps continued, moving slowly around the edge of the camp, just beyond the firelight. My stomach churned, and I reached for my knife, holding it tight. Whatever it was still out there, getting closer. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the footsteps stopped. Everything went quiet again. I strained my eyes, trying to see what was out there, but it was too dark. I gripped the knife harder, trying to stay calm, but then the smell hit me all at once. Stronger than before, like it was coming from everywhere at once. It made my skin crawl. That's when I saw it. One of the sleeping bags was empty. One of the guys was gone. My blood ran cold. How could he have just disappeared without making a sound? I looked around, scanning the ground, but there were no tracks, no sign of him. Just that awful smell hanging in the air. I wanted to panic, but I forced myself to stay still, to think. We were trained for this kind of thing, to handle danger. But this was different. This was fear like I had never felt before. I didn't wake the others. I didn't know what waking them would do. Instead, I waited. I waited for whatever had taken him to make its next move. The night stretched on, feeling like it would never end. I stayed awake, knife in hand, my eyes scanning the darkness, listening for any sound. But nothing happened. It was just silent. By the time the sun came up, the smell had faded. The forest felt normal again. Birds were chirping, the wind was rustling the leaves. But our teammate was still gone. No sign of him anywhere, no tracks, no blood. Just gone. We packed up in silence, that strange, heavy feeling still hanging over us. We didn't talk about what had happened. It was like none of us wanted to admit it was real. But I knew. We all did. As we left the forest, something didn't sit right with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there, whatever had taken him, was still watching us. Like it was waiting for the right time to come back. I don't know what it was. Maybe I'll never know. But I do know one thing. If it wanted to, it could have taken us all. And I don't think we'll ever be safe no matter where we go. Still out there, waiting. I had been thinking about this hiking trip for months. My ex-wife, Lisa, and I used to go hiking a lot when we were married, so it felt weird being out here alone. But after everything, I thought being alone might help me clear my mind. I only brought what I needed and headed deep into the woods. The trail wasn't one people used much anymore. That's why I liked it. The first few hours went by peacefully. The sound of leaves under my boots and birds in the distance reminded me of simpler times. I set up my tent near a small open spot by a stream, a place I knew well. I planned to spend the night, hike a bit more the next day, and then head back. As the sun started going down, the woods became really quiet. At first, I didn't mind. I even liked it. But once it got darker, I started feeling uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Even though I hadn't seen a single person all day, I built a small fire mostly to feel safer. The flames danced, casting shadows on the trees, and I tried to focus on the sound of the stream nearby. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Every little noise made me jump. A twig snapping, something moving in the bushes, normal sounds, but in the dark, it felt like something was getting closer. I kept telling myself I was just imagining things. I'd been out here before, and I knew the woods could mess with your mind when it got dark. Still, I found myself looking around, half expecting to see something or someone just outside the firelight. Time dragged on, and eventually I decided to call it a night. I put out the fire, got inside my tent, and tried to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. Something felt off. The air was too still, too heavy, and that creeping feeling that I wasn't alone was stronger now. I stayed completely still, listening. Then I heard it, a soft rustling sound outside the tent. It was faint but real. My heart started pounding. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I wasn't alone anymore. I reached for my flashlight as quietly as I could. When I turned it on, the light filled the tent. I heard the rustling again, even closer now, right outside. I knew I had to see what it was. Slowly, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The light landed on something, no, someone. A person was standing a few feet away, just at the edge of the clearing. My stomach dropped. I didn't know who they were, but they were staring straight at my tent, not moving. They had been there a while, just standing there. I froze, gripping the flashlight so tightly my hand hurt. Who just stands there in the middle of the night in the woods? They didn't move. They didn't make a sound. They just stood there watching. I could barely breathe. Without thinking, I slowly zipped the tent back up, my heart racing. I sat there, frozen, not sure what to do next. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I didn't hear anything, but I knew they were still out there, waiting. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat there, staring at the tent wall, listening. When the first light of dawn finally showed, I slowly unzipped the tent again, hoping the person was gone. The clearing was empty, but the grass where they had stood was flattened. I hadn't imagined it. They had been there, right there, just watching me. I packed up as fast as I could and left that campsite behind without looking back. I didn't care about the rest of the hike. I just wanted to get out of there. I never went back to that trail. I still don't know who that person was or why they were there. Maybe they were just passing through. But the way they stood there, watching me, without saying or doing anything, wasn't normal. I think about that night sometimes, the way they didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. Sometimes late at night, I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed out there longer. I'd been out camping alone for a few days, trying to clear my head. I liked coming to this remote spot whenever I needed some quiet. It was a long stretch of forest where hardly anyone ever came. The trail ran through thick trees and over steep hills, and it was so quiet, it felt like the rest of the world didn't even exist. That's what I liked about it. But after 2 nights, I started getting this feeling in my gut, like something was off. It was that kind of feeling you can't put your finger on, but it makes you uneasy. At first, it was small, like a shift in the air. I figured it was just me being alone for too long. When you're out in the woods for days, it's easy for your mind to start playing tricks. Still, the feeling stuck with me like something wasn't right. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just nerves. Maybe I wasn't used to being so far away from everything for this long. On the 3rd day, I decided to hike to a river nearby to get more water. The trail was as quiet as usual, except for the sound of birds, the wind, and the leaves crunching under my boots. But as I got closer to the river, I noticed something weird. A small piece of red cloth was stuck on a branch, torn and moving in the wind. It didn't seem like it belonged here, like it was out of place. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were fresh in the dirt, and they weren't the kind you'd expect from another hiker. These were heavy and deep, like someone had been running. They led away from the river, straight toward my camp. My heart started racing. I stood there for a second, frozen. I wasn't alone out here. Someone had been walking around, and I had no idea who they were or what they wanted. I followed the tracks back to my camp, moving as quietly as I could, trying to step lightly. That weird feeling in my gut got worse, and I couldn't shake the thought that whoever made those footprints was still around. The trees felt darker, even though the sun was still up. By the time I got back to my tent, the feeling of being watched was unbearable. And then I saw it. My tent had been ripped open. My stuff was everywhere, like someone had gone through it. Nothing was taken, but it was all destroyed, like someone was trying to send me a message. I stood there, the weight of what was happening finally sinking in. This wasn't an animal. It wasn't just some careless person passing through. Someone had found my camp and wrecked it while I was gone. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed what I could, threw it into my pack, and started moving fast. There was no way I was staying out here another night. As I hiked back down the trail, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone behind me. The feeling of being followed clung to me, no matter how fast I walked. By the time I made it to the parking lot where my car was, the sun was starting to set. I was exhausted, my nerves were shot, but I felt a bit of relief when I saw my car still sitting there. I threw my bag into the back seat, ready to get out of there as fast as I could. Just as I was about to start the car, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. A police car was parked at the far end of the lot. At first, I thought it was just routine, maybe checking on the area, but then I noticed something strange. The driver's side door was open, and there was no one inside. No sign of anyone around. I got out of my car and slowly walked toward the police car. The closer I got, the worse the feeling in my stomach became. When I reached the car, I looked inside and saw something that made my blood run cold. There was blood on the driver's seat. Not old, dried blood, this was fresh. Just a few feet away, the dirt was all messed up, like there had been a struggle. My heart started pounding, my mind racing. I didn't know what had happened, but I knew I needed to leave, fast. I turned to head back to my car, but before I could get in, I saw something in the woods, just beyond the parking lot. A figure standing still, half hidden in the shadows. I couldn't make out who it was, but they were watching me. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there staring. My body froze, my brain screaming at me to run, but I couldn't stop looking at them. The air around me felt heavy, like the world had stopped moving. I finally snapped out of it and bolted for my car. I jumped in, slammed the door, and sped down the dirt road as fast as I could, not looking back. My heart was racing the whole way home, and that feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. Even after I made it back, I kept expecting to see that figure standing in the shadows, just waiting for me to let my guard down. It's been weeks since that day, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm not done with whatever was out there. Every time I step outside, I get that same gut feeling I had in the woods. The police never found anything, and no one knows what happened to the officer who drove that car. But deep down, I think I know. Something or someone was out there watching, and I have a feeling they're not done watching me yet. I took my grandmother camping for the first time. She wasn't really into being outside much, but I thought it would be a nice break for her. We found a quiet spot by a lake, with thick trees all around. It was peaceful, with the kind of silence you only get far from the city. After we set up camp, Grandma wanted to go for a short walk, so we grabbed our things and started walking into the trees. The path was narrow, and the trees were so tall that they blocked out most of the sunlight. The deeper we went into the woods, the less we could see of the lake behind us. As we walked, I started to feel something wasn't right. The woods weren't just quiet. They felt strangely still. No birds, no wind in the leaves, just dead silence. It felt like the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the feeling didn't go away. Even Grandma, who never really got scared, seemed to be looking around a lot more than usual, like she was feeling it too. We had been walking for about an hour when the path suddenly split into a few different directions. There weren't any signs or anything to tell us where to go. I didn't want to worry Grandma, but I wasn't sure which way we came from. We tried a few different paths, but every single one led us deeper into the woods. Nothing looked familiar, and the lake seemed further and further away. The sun was starting to go down, and long shadows stretched out across the trees. I tried to stay calm, not wanting to freak Grandma out, but inside, I could feel a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. Every trail we took seemed to circle back or lead us into more trees. It was like we were stuck in some kind of endless loop with no way out. As it got darker, I started using my knife to mark the trees, hoping to leave a trail, but even those marks seemed to vanish after a while. No matter where we turned, we were trapped. The weird silence was everywhere, and now the darkness was closing in fast. I decided we should stop and wait until morning. Maybe with some light, we'd be able to figure out where we were. We sat down next to a big tree, trying to save our energy. The cold started to creep in, and I tried to push away the feeling of being completely lost. I had never felt so helpless before. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, steady footsteps in the trees behind us. At first, I thought it was maybe another camper or someone hiking late at night, but the footsteps stopped. I listened hard, trying to hear where they went, but there was nothing, just that heavy, suffocating silence. A few minutes passed, and I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard them again, this time closer. Whoever was out there wasn't just walking by. They were following us. I didn't move, hoping they'd just go away. But they didn't. The footsteps came to a stop again, right behind the trees. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I knew someone was there, watching us, waiting. Neither of us slept after that. Every so often, the footsteps would come back, stopping just before they got too close. It was like they were testing us, playing some sick game. It wasn't an animal. It was something else, something with a plan. As the first light of morning started to shine through the trees, the footsteps stopped for good. I stood up, my legs aching, and knew we had to get out of there as fast as possible. But even in daylight, the woods didn't feel right. It was still too quiet, too empty. After what felt like hours, we finally found a path that led back to the lake. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I didn't feel safe until we got to the car and started driving far away from that place. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but it wasn't an accident. It felt like something had been waiting for us. Something real. Something dangerous. I never told Grandma about it, and she never asked to go camping again. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear those footsteps. Steady, slow, getting closer. I never look out the window. Something tells me it's better if I don't. Last summer, my stepsister Clara and I decided to escape the city and go camping in the mountains. We both liked hiking, so we chose a trail known for its beautiful views and moderate challenge. We planned to camp overnight and hike back the next morning. We got to the trailhead late in the afternoon and quickly set up our camp. The sun was setting, creating long shadows on the forest floor. The sky turned a deep orange, and the air grew cooler. After dinner, we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and enjoying the quiet of the woods. As night came, the forest grew silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves. We went to bed early, hoping to get a good night's sleep before our hike. Clara fell asleep almost instantly, but I had trouble. The silence felt unsettling, like the forest was holding its breath. Around midnight, I heard a faint noise outside the tent. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. My heart raced. I nudged Clara, but she was sound asleep. I listened carefully, trying to figure out where the sounds were coming from. They seemed to be circling our camp. I grabbed my flashlight and carefully unzipped the tent. The light cut through the darkness, showing nothing but trees and shadows. I listened hard but saw nothing out of place, so I went back inside, trying to calm down. The footsteps had stopped. Just as I was about to fall asleep again, I heard something heavy brushing against the side of the tent. I froze. The noise was closer this time, and the tent fabric pressed inwards as if someone or something was pushing against it. My mind raced with fear, but I knew I had to do something. I slowly unzipped the tent again, the zipper making a loud sound in the still night. I shone the flashlight outside, scanning the area. I saw a dark shape moving quickly between the trees. My heart pounded. I had to wake Clara. I shook her awake, whispering urgently. We packed our gear as fast as we could, our breaths coming out in short, panicked bursts. The feeling of being watched never left us as we packed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shadow again. As we were about to leave, I noticed a small pile of rocks near our campsite that hadn't been there before. It looked like someone had carefully stacked them. My stomach dropped. We hurried back to the trail, moving quickly but carefully. The eerie feeling stayed with us all the way down the mountain. When we reached the trailhead, the sun was just starting to rise. We were exhausted but relieved to be back. We never found out who or what had been circling our camp, but the sight of those rocks and the feeling of being watched made it clear that something, or someone, had been there with us. We never went back to that trail, The experience left us both anxious about camping alone in the woods. The memory of that night lingers, a chilling reminder of how easily safety can vanish in the wilderness. As we left, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been watching us was still out there, waiting for another chance. It was a chilly autumn morning when I set out for a solo hike in the nearby mountains. The air was crisp, and the sun cast long shadows through the trees. I planned to spend the night camping by a quiet lake that was supposed to be peaceful and far from people. The trail was easy at first, meandering gently through the woods. The bright fall colors were amazing, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional chirp of a bird. By noon, I reached a clearing where I decided to set up camp. I set up my tent close to the lake, enjoying the calm and the soft sound of water lapping at the shore. As night fell, I started a small fire to cook my dinner. The crackling flames and the warmth were comforting against the growing cold. After eating, I sat by the fire, watching the stars come out in the clear sky. It was the kind of night where everything felt perfect, until I heard a noise that didn't fit. At first, it was faint, like a soft rustling or shuffling. I thought it might be a small animal, but as the night went on, the noise got louder. It seemed to come from the edge of the forest near my campsite. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind or an animal moving around. But the noise kept going, and it wasn't random. It had a pattern, almost like it was trying to get my attention. The tension grew with each passing hour. I couldn't see anything in the dark, and the noise wouldn't stop. Now and then, I'd hear a twig snap or a faint thud, making me jump. I kept my flashlight close, trying to reassure myself that it was nothing serious. Finally, I decided to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and a sturdy stick for protection and carefully headed toward the noise. The area around the lake was thick with trees and underbrush. As I got closer, the noises suddenly stopped, leaving a heavy silence. I shone my flashlight around, looking for anything out of place, but saw nothing unusual. Just as I was about to head back, I noticed something disturbing: fresh footprints in the mud near the water's edge. They were large, and they looked like they had been made recently. My heart raced as I realized that someone, or something, had been watching me. The prints led off into the forest, but I didn't follow them. The thought of someone or something hidden in the woods made my skin crawl. I quickly went back to my campsite, feeling a mix of relief and fear. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, deciding it was best to leave before it got any darker. As I drove away, the forest slowly disappeared behind me, but the fear didn't leave. The image of those footprints and the strange noises haunted me long after I left the mountains. I never found out who or what had been in the forest that night, but I knew one thing for sure: something was out there watching and waiting. The eerie silence of the forest and the mystery of those footprints made me realize that sometimes the scariest things are not the ones we can see, but the ones that leave us feeling watched and vulnerable. I was in the Austrian army, and we were sent on a routine training mission in the mountains. It was supposed to be a few days of hiking and camping, getting used to the tough conditions. The higher we went, the colder it got, and the paths became harder to walk. But it wasn't anything we couldn't handle. We set up camp one evening on a rocky hill. It was far from any village or road. The view was amazing, but something about the quiet felt wrong. The camp was simple: just some tents, a fire pit, and our gear piled up nearby. After hiking all day, we were wiped out. We lay down, trying to get some sleep before the next day's march. The night was freezing. The wind was loud as it whipped through the mountains, but there were no other sounds. That struck me as odd. Usually, even in the wild, you'd hear something: branches cracking, leaves rustling. But here it was just the wind and nothing else. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, Not sure why. Something felt off. The fire had burned out, and the cold was creeping in. I listened closely, trying to hear anything, but it was just the wind. I lay there for a while, wide awake, staring at the inside of the tent. My heart was racing, though I didn't know why. Then I heard it, a soft crunch of gravel just outside the tent. Slow, steady, like someone walking carefully, trying not to be heard. I froze. No one should have been out there. We were all exhausted, and everyone had gone to bed. The steps circled the camp, deliberate and quiet. It wasn't the wind, and it didn't sound like an animal. The steps were too slow, too controlled. I stayed still, barely breathing, hoping it was just one of the guys, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The steps were too cautious, too precise. Whoever or whatever was out there knew we were here and didn't want to be seen. Hours seemed to pass before the sound finally faded, the footsteps slowly disappearing into the distance. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The cold seemed to tighten around me, and the dark felt endless. I wasn't alone. The next morning, I could see the same fear on everyone's faces. No one said a word about it, but we all knew something wasn't right. We packed up fast and got moving, trying to shake off the unease. The plan was to hike further into the mountains and set up camp again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I kept looking behind me, scanning the trees and rocks. The mountains felt heavy, like they were closing in on us, as if the whole place was aware of our presence. That night, we set up camp again, but it wasn't any better. Once more, I heard the footsteps, slow, steady, walking around the camp. No one moved. We all just sat there, barely breathing, listening. The steps stayed just outside the light of our fire, like whoever was out there knew how far to stay back to avoid being seen. By the third night, we couldn't take it anymore. The tension was too much. None of us slept. We sat near the dying fire, waiting. The footsteps came again, circling us, moving with the same unnerving slowness. But this time, I realized it wasn't just one set of steps. There were several. They were closing in little by little, step by step. When morning finally came, we didn't talk about it. We packed up and started down the mountain without a word, ending the exercise early. We didn't care about the plan anymore. We just wanted to get out of there. Even as we made our way down, that feeling of being watched didn't go away. It followed us all the way down the mountain. Even when we reached the trees and the familiar landscape, it was still there. Something was watching us. We didn't stop until we were back at the barracks. I've been on a lot of hikes and training missions since then, but nothing like that. I don't know what was out there, but something followed us through those mountains. Something real, something alive. We never saw it, but I know it was there, watching us, stalking us. And whatever it was, it didn't stop when we left. I still think about those nights, the silence, and the footsteps. I can't explain it, but I know it wasn't human. Not an animal either. But it was out there, tracking us, waiting for something. And I can't shake the feeling that, one day, it'll follow me again. In 1978, I decided to go on a camping trip by myself. I picked a spot deep in the woods, far from any people, thinking it would be a good way to clear my head from all the noise of the city. I've always liked being out in nature, and this place seemed perfect for the peace and quiet I was looking for. The hike to the campsite took most of the day. The trail wasn't in great shape, overgrown with weeds, barely visible in some spots. I had to check my map a lot more than I thought I would. By the time I found a small clearing to set up camp, the sun was starting to set. I pitched my tent and built a small fire. The trees around me were thick, and it felt like I was cut off from everything else. The only sounds were the wind through the leaves and a few birds calling out in the distance. I felt totally alone, which was exactly what I wanted. As night fell, everything got darker than I expected. With no city lights around, the stars barely lit up the sky, and the trees looked like black shadows all around me. The fire was the only light I had, and I sat there eating a simple meal, staring at the flames. Felt peaceful at first, just me and the crackling fire. But after a while, something started to feel off. I noticed that the usual sounds of the woods, the birds, the crickets, the leaves moving, had stopped. It was completely quiet. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just the woods settling down for the night, but it still felt strange. Then I heard it, just a small snap like a twig breaking. It was faint and far away, but I noticed it right away. I sat up and looked into the darkness surrounding me, but the firelight didn't reach far. Beyond it, everything was just black. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a deer, but the silence didn't feel right. Even when animals are close by, the woods aren't this quiet. I threw a few more logs on the fire, hoping the light would calm me down. It helped for a little while, and I could feel myself relaxing again, listening to the fire crackle. A few hours passed, and I decided to try and get some sleep. Lying in my tent, I could still feel the quiet around me. Every little sound felt loud. My own breathing, the wind outside the tent, and the last bits of the fire slowly burning out. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time, it was closer. Another snap, followed by the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. It wasn't loud, but it was too deliberate to be just the wind. My heart started racing, and I sat up, listening hard. There it was again, closer now. The sound of something or someone slowly moving through the woods. I didn't want to leave the tent, but I unzipped it just enough to peek outside. The fire was almost out, just a few glowing embers, and I couldn't see much in the dim light. But I could still hear the sound, slow and steady, like someone carefully walking toward my campsite. I froze, barely breathing, hoping that whatever it was would move on. But the sound didn't stop, kept coming closer and closer until it was right at the edge of the clearing. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something was out there, just beyond the firelight, standing still, watching. I didn't move. I didn't dare make a sound. I just sat there, waiting for whatever it was to do something, but nothing happened. The night went completely silent again. No footsteps, no rustling leaves, just the quiet of the woods and the dim glow of the fire. I stayed awake for hours, too scared to sleep, just listening. Eventually, my exhaustion got the better of me, and I must have passed out because the next thing I knew, the sun was up, and the woods were alive with the sound of birds and rustling leaves again. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I packed up my gear quickly, eager to leave. As I was folding up my tent, I saw something in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. Footprints. They weren't mine. They came from the woods and stopped right where I'd heard the sounds the night before. It was like someone had walked out of the trees and stood there, watching me while I slept. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed the rest of my things and hurried back down the trail. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being watched the whole way back. But every time I looked around, I didn't see anything. Still, the feeling stayed with me, like eyes were on me the entire hike. When I finally got to my car, I tossed my gear inside and drove off as fast as I could. My hands were shaking the whole way, and I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. I've never gone back to that campsite. I've never camped alone since then. The idea that someone stood there, silently watching me while I was out in the middle of nowhere, still makes my skin crawl. But the worst part? I'll never know if they were planning to do more than just watch. Maybe next time they won't just stand there. Maybe next time they'll get closer. Camping has always been something I enjoy, especially in the quiet places away from everyone. Being a police officer, I really liked the alone time, the quiet. It gave me a break from the stress of my job. So, when I got a few days off, I decided to go hiking and camping in the national forest, far away from the city and all its noise. I packed my stuff, put on my hiking boots, and headed out by myself. Just me, the woods, and the peace I needed. The walk to the campsite wasn't too hard. I had picked a spot deep in the woods, away from the regular campsites. I wanted to be alone. After a few hours of walking, I found a small open area that seemed perfect. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got ready for a quiet night. The woods were calm, except for the sound of a few animals moving around. That didn't bother me. I had done this plenty of times before, and it always felt safe. As the sun went down, the woods got darker. I started a fire and sat down to eat. The heat from the flames felt good because the air was getting colder. I stared at the fire for a while, letting the crackling would relax me, trying to forget about the stress of work. It felt good to be away from everything. Around midnight, I woke up. I wasn't sure what woke me up, but something did. Maybe the fire had gone out, or maybe it was just too quiet. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening. There was nothing. No wind, no crickets, no animals moving around. Just dead silence. I turned over, trying to ignore it. It was probably just normal. But then I heard something. A faint sound, like something moving outside my tent. It was soft at first, but then I could hear it more clearly. It was like footsteps, slow and careful. I sat up, fully awake now. The hair on my arms stood up as I listened closer. Whatever it was, it didn't seem to care about being quiet anymore. The footsteps were louder now, going around my tent. It wasn't an animal. These were human footsteps. Someone walking slowly, trying not to be heard. My instincts kicked in. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and slowly unzipped the tent just enough to look outside. The light cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anyone. I pointed the flashlight around, checking the trees and the shadows, but there was nothing. I stepped out of the tent, holding the flashlight tightly, feeling exposed. I scanned the area again, but everything looked normal. The trees were still, the shadows long, but no sign of anyone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching. I sat by the fire for the rest of the night, not going back to sleep. I kept the flashlight close, my back to the tent, staring into the darkness. The silence returned, but it wasn't comforting. Couldn't relax. I felt like I wasn't alone, like someone or something was out there, just beyond the light of the fire. The next morning, I decided to pack up earlier than I had planned. I didn't feel right staying any longer. As I took down the tent, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Just a few feet from where I had slept were footprints. Human footprints, clear in the dirt, circling around my tent. They weren't fresh either. They'd been there, left by someone who had been watching me all night. I've been in some tough situations at work, but this felt different. This wasn't something I could control. Whoever had been out there, creeping around my camp, wasn't some criminal I could deal with. I had no idea who they were or what they wanted. I started the hike back, moving faster than usual. Every time I heard the trees rustle or a branch snap, I felt my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The whole way back, I kept looking over my shoulder, but I never saw anything. I just felt it. When I finally got to my car, I threw my gear into the back and got in. I didn't look back at the trail or the woods. I just started driving, wanting to get as far away as possible. Even now, I can't forget that night. I've handled a lot as a cop, but what happened in those woods was something else. It wasn't about catching someone or solving a case. It was about something much worse, because whoever was out there wasn't just passing through. They were watching. They knew I was there, and they were waiting. And the worst part? I still don't know why. I had been walking for hours, the path going through thick trees and rocky ground. The plan was simple: hike to a far-off spot, stay the night, and head back the next day. The weather was supposed to be clear, and I had enough food and water for the trip. It was just me out there, alone with nature, which I usually liked. I found a good spot to set up camp just before it got dark, a small open area surrounded by tall trees. The wind started to pick up a little, making the leaves rustle, but I didn't think much of it. After setting up my tent and getting some food, I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance around. The quiet was different from being at home. It felt heavier, more noticeable. Every time a branch snapped or a bush moved, it sounded louder than normal. As the night went on, I got into my tent, letting the fire die down. First, it was peaceful. I listened to the wind in the trees and slowly started to drift off to sleep. But at some point, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. My heart was racing, pounding in my chest, but I didn't know what had set me off. I lay there, completely still, trying to hear something, anything, that might explain the feeling of unease creeping over me. Then I heard it. Footsteps, quiet but definitely there. And they weren't far away either. They were close, way too close. Whoever it was, they were moving around the camp, slowly and on purpose. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing. It wasn't an animal. I knew that right away. The steps were too slow, too heavy for that. I don't know how long I lay there, listening. My heart was racing, and my hands were starting to sweat. The footsteps would stop for a while, then start again. They moved in a circle around my tent, never going far, like whoever was out there was waiting for something. I thought about unzipping the tent to see what was going on, but fear kept me glued in place. I didn't want to make a sound. I didn't want them to know I was awake. After what felt like forever, the footsteps finally stopped. Everything went quiet again, but it didn't make me feel any better. I just lay there, wide awake, hoping for the night to end, waiting for the sun to come up. I'm pretty sure I didn't sleep after that at all. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I packed up my camp as fast as I could. I didn't even stop to eat. I just wanted to leave. As I made my way back down the trail, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But the path behind me was empty. When I finally reached the parking lot and saw my car, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. I threw my gear in the back and drove off, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling. All I could think about was those footsteps circling my tent, how they never went far, like they were waiting for me to come out. I never went back to that spot again. In fact, I don't hike alone anymore. I don't think I'll ever be able to. Something was out there that night, and whatever it wasn't just passing through. It was watching, waiting. A few days later, I went online and looked up reports about the area. That's when I saw it. About a month before my trip, someone had gone missing while hiking not too far from where I had camped. No one ever found them. I couldn't stop thinking about it after that. How the footsteps circled my tent, never leaving, almost like they were waiting for me to make a mistake. Whoever or whatever was out there that night wasn't done yet. And I think maybe I was supposed to be next. Last summer, my grandmother and I decided to go camping in some remote hills we'd heard about from friends. It was meant to be a peaceful escape, just us and nature. We got to the trailhead early in the morning and started our hike with high hopes, carrying our backpacks filled with camping gear. The trail was narrow and overgrown. We moved carefully but steadily, enjoying the fresh air and the sounds of the forest. When the sun was high, we found a clearing that was perfect for setting up camp. The spot was lovely, surrounded by tall trees and a small stream nearby. After setting up the tent and unpacking, we decided to take a short hike to explore more. We followed a path that looked like it would loop back to the camp, but it soon became unclear and tangled. The forest grew thicker, and soon, there were no bird songs or the usual forest sounds. It was unusually quiet, but I brushed it off as just being deeper in the woods. We kept walking, but the trail seemed to take us further from the camp. As evening came, the light faded quickly, and shadows grew longer. I began to feel uneasy, realizing we had gone too far. My grandmother, always calm, stayed quiet but seemed worried. Eventually, we decided to head back, but the forest seemed different now. Trees that had looked familiar before now seemed strange, and the once clear path was swallowed by darkness. The temperature dropped, and the cool air felt freezing against my skin. We used our flashlight to find our way, but it only made creepy, flickering shadows on the trees. Just as panic started to set in, we heard something rustling in the bushes. I pointed the flashlight that way, but there was nothing there, just the deepening gloom of the forest. We rushed back, our footsteps echoing loudly in the eerie silence. After what felt like hours, we finally found a landmark we recognized. A large, twisted oak tree we had passed earlier. Relieved but exhausted, we followed the direction back to the camp. When we reached our campsite, it was completely dark. The area was unnervingly quiet, with no sounds of animals or the stream we'd heard before. We decided to stay inside the tent for the night, our nerves frayed from the unsettling experience. The darkness outside felt even more oppressive, and every creak of the tent made us jump. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of something scratching at the tent. I was too scared to move, holding my breath. The scratching continued, then stopped suddenly. I peeked outside with the flashlight, but saw nothing, just the blackness of the forest. The air outside felt colder, and the silence was heavy. The next morning, we packed up quickly and left the campsite. As we hiked back to the trailhead, I looked back at the forest. It felt like it was watching us, hiding something sinister behind its trees. The forest had shown us a side that was far from welcoming, and we were glad to be leaving it behind. Back at the car, we were worn out but relieved. The hike had pushed us to our limits, and even though nothing concrete happened, the eerie silence and the unsettling experience had left a deep mark. The forest had a dark secret, one that seemed to watch us as we left, hinting that it had more to reveal if we ever dared to return. I had been thinking about going camping alone for a while, so I finally decided to do it. I packed my gear and headed to the mountains. The hike up was quiet and peaceful, just me and the trail. The sound of nature surrounded me, birds chirping, leaves rustling. After walking for a few hours, I found a nice open spot by a small river, perfect for setting up my camp. The sun was still up, so I spent some time gathering wood for a fire and just taking in the view. Everything felt calm, the kind of calm that makes you feel like nothing could go wrong. As the evening went on, the air got cold fast. I lit the fire and sat by it, eating some food I brought. The night was clear, and the sky was full of stars. It was the kind of night that makes you forget all the noise in your head. After a while, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep. A few hours later, I woke up. Something felt wrong. The fire had burned down to almost nothing, just a few glowing bits left. The forest was completely silent. It wasn't the usual nighttime quiet where you can still hear insects or the wind blowing. It was dead quiet. I stayed still in my sleeping bag, listening for anything, but there wasn't a sound. Not even the river nearby. That was weird. I should have been able to hear the water. My heart started to beat faster, I realized how alone I really was out there. I slowly sat up, trying to shake off the feeling. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But then I heard it, a deep, heavy thud. It sounded far away at first, like something big moving through the woods. I held my breath, waiting to hear it again, but it didn't come. I told myself I was just hearing things, that it was probably nothing. I laid back down, but I couldn't sleep. After what felt like forever, I heard the noise again. It was closer this time. Another heavy thud, like something large walking through the forest. I froze, my whole body stiffening. The sound got louder, each step coming closer to my tent. My heart was pounding in my chest as I listened to the sound stop just outside my tent. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Whatever it was huge. I could feel the ground shake slightly with each step it took. The air in the tent felt thick, hard to breathe, like the silence was pressing down on me. My mind raced, trying to figure out what it could be. A bear? Maybe a large animal like a deer? But it didn't sound right. The footsteps were too slow, too heavy. The thing started moving around my tent, slowly circling it. Each step was deliberate, like it was checking me out, trying to figure out what was inside. My heart was racing so hard I thought it was going to give me away. I stayed completely still, staring up at the dark roof of my tent, barely able to breathe. Then it stopped, right at the entrance of the tent. I could see the faint shadow of something big through the thin material. Stood there, not moving, for what felt like hours. My muscles were aching from staying so still, but I didn't dare move. Finally, the steps started again, slow and steady, moving away from my tent. I stayed completely still, listening as the sound grew fainter and fainter. Even after I couldn't hear it anymore, I didn't move. I lay there in the silence, staring at the ceiling of my tent, waiting for it to come back. But it didn't. When the first bit of light started to creep through the trees, I forced myself to move. My whole body was stiff and sore from the fear, but I didn't care. I needed to leave. I quickly packed up my things, not bothering to clean up or do anything I usually would. I just threw everything in my bag and started walking back down the trail as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached my car. Even now, I have no idea what was out there. But later, when I was thinking back on it, something hit me that I hadn't noticed before. There was no sound of leaves or branches breaking when it walked. No crunch of the forest floor. Just those heavy, slow thuds. It wasn't walking on the ground. It was walking through the air. The sun was setting as I finished setting up my tent at the remote campsite. It was a lonely spot, tucked deep in the woods. I was alone for this weekend getaway, hoping for some peace and a chance to clear my mind. The forest was calm, with only the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of crickets breaking the quiet. I cooked a simple meal over the campfire and then went to bed early, looking forward to a restful night. I zipped up my tent and settled into my sleeping bag, feeling relaxed. In the middle of the night, I was suddenly woken by a faint noise. At first, it was hard to identify, just a distant thump, like something heavy hitting the ground. I dismissed it as a fallen branch or a big animal moving through the underbrush. But the sound continued, steady and deliberate. I lay there in the dark, my heart racing. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the noise grew louder and closer. The thumps were now mixed with a dragging sound, like something being pulled through the forest. I was frozen with fear, too scared to make a sound or move. Finally, I gathered enough courage to peek outside. I unzipped the tent slowly and saw nothing at first, just the pitch-black forest. But then, I saw a dim light moving through the trees, like the glow of a lantern. The light swayed and moved closer to my camp. I jumped up and grabbed a flashlight, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. As the light came nearer, I realized it wasn't just one light but several, like a procession. I could hear quiet voices and soft murmurs, but they were too faint to make out. My mind raced with the worst possibilities. I thought about the chance of someone else being out here, someone who didn't want to be seen. I felt sweat on my forehead and a sinking feeling in my stomach. I made a quick decision and grabbed my backpack. Quietly, I unzipped the tent, slipped out, and started walking away from the campsite. I followed a faint trail I knew led back to the main hiking path, moving fast but silently. The noises behind me grew quieter as I put more distance between us. When I finally reached the main trail, I kept going until I got to the nearest ranger station. Exhausted and scared, I told the rangers what had happened. They said they'd check out the area, but they couldn't do anything until morning. I spent the rest of the night at the ranger station, feeling like I was still being watched. The next day, a ranger came with me back to my campsite. Everything was as I had left it, with no signs of anyone else. The ranger suggested it might have been a group of people camping nearby, but they couldn't confirm it. Even though the campsite was empty, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The ranger found nothing unusual, but I couldn't ignore the fact that the noises had stopped right after I left. It felt like someone or something had been waiting for me to leave before they moved in. I packed up my gear and left the campsite behind, vowing never to camp in that isolated spot again. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about the procession of lights and the dragging sounds. It was clear now that I had been watched the whole time. The fear of the unknown hung over me, knowing that whatever was out there was still waiting in the darkness.